5. Liberal community. In the last two chapters, we have been considering what place two central political ideals, liberty and democracy, play in a society that is committed to equality when equality is understood as requiring equal resources rather than equal welfare or well-being over a lifetime. In this chapter, we consider the place, in such a society, of the further political ideal of community. We shall focus on an old problem: should conventional ethics be enforced through the criminal law? Throughout this book, I distinguish ethics from morality. Ethics, I use the term, includes convictions about which kinds of lives are good or bad for a person to lead. And morality includes principles about how a person should treat other people. So the question I consider is whether a political community should use criminal law to force its members to lead what a majority deems good lives. Deems good lives, yes, not whether it should use the law to force them to behave justly to others. Was the Supreme Court right in Bowers versus Hardwick to uphold, against constitutional challenge, Georgia's law making sodomy a crime? It is widely thought that liberal tolerance, which insists that it is wrong of government to use its coercive power to enforce ethical homogeneity, undermines community because the heart of community is a shared ethical code. I shall argue that if liberal tolerance is understood against the background of the conception of equality I have been defining, then such tolerance is not only consistent with the most attractive conception of community, but is indispensable to it. Very different arguments, using very different concepts of community, have been used to attack liberal tolerance in different ways. I distinguish four such arguments. The first is an argument from democratic theory which associates community with majority. In Bowers, Justice Byron White suggested that the community has a right to use the law to support its vision of ethical decency. It has a right to impose its views about ethics just because it is the majority. The second is an argument of paternalism. It holds that in a genuine political community, each citizen has a responsibility for the well-being of other members and should therefore use his political power to reform those whose defective practices will ruin their lives. The third is an argument of self-interest, broadly conceived. It condemns atomism, the view that individuals are self-sufficient, and emphasizes the wide variety of ways, material, intellectual, and ethical, in which people need community. It insists that liberal tolerance undermines the community's ability to serve these needs. The fourth, which I shall call integration, argues that liberal tolerance depends on an illegitimate distinction between the lives of individual people within the community and the life of the community as a whole. According to this argument, the value of or goodness of any individual citizen's life is only a reflection and function of the value of the life of the community in which he lives. So citizens, in order to make their own life successful, must vote and work to make sure that their fellow citizens lead decent lives. Each of these arguments uses the concept of community in an increasingly more substantial and less reductive way. The first argument, that a democratic majority has a right to define ethical standards for all, uses community only as a shorthand symbol for a particular, numerically defined political grouping. The second argument, which encourages paternalism, gives the concept more substance. It defines community not as just a political group, but as the dimensions of a shared and distinct responsibility. The third argument, that people need community, recognizes community as an entity in its own right, as a source of a wide variety of influences and benefits not reducible to the contributions of particular people one by one. The fourth argument, about identification, further personifies community and describes a sense in which a political community is not only independent of, but prior to, individual citizens. In this chapter, I concentrate on this fourth argument, partly because I have not discussed it before, but also because I find its root idea that people should identify their own interests with those of their political community true and valuable. Properly understood, the idea furnishes no argument against liberal tolerance and no support for Bowers. On the contrary, liberalism supplies the best interpretation of this concept of community, and liberal theory the best account of its importance. 1. Community and democracy. Some liberals have thought that liberal tolerance can be fully justified by John Stuart Mill's harm principle, which holds that the state may properly restrain someone's liberty only to prevent his harming others, not himself. On liberty. In Law, Liberty and Morality, H.L.A. Hart argued that this principle rules out legislation making homosexual acts criminal. Law, Liberty and Morality. But Hart's argument is sound only if we limit harm to physical injury to person or property. Every community has an ethical environment, and that environment makes a difference to the lives its members can lead. A community that tolerates homosexuality, and in which homosexuality has a strong presence, provides a different ethical environment from one in which homosexuality is forbidden, and some people believe themselves harmed by the difference. They find it much harder, for example, to raise their children to absorb instincts and values of which they approve. The first argument against liberal tolerance declares that questions about the shape of a democratic community's ethical environment should be decided in accordance with the majority's will. It argues not merely that whatever decisions the political officials elected by the majority make should be accepted as law, but that these political officials should make decisions that reflect the preferences of a majority rather than any minority. We might object to procedural as well as substantive majoritarianism in the case of enforcing morals. We might say that such questions should be decided not by elected officials but by a constitutional court such as the Supreme Court. I am not considering that procedural question here, however. See Chapter 4 in Ronald Dworkin, Equality, Democracy and Constitution. We the People in Court. Alberta Law Review. This is substantive rather than merely procedural majoritarianism. The argument does not assume that any minority's moral views are base or wicked, but only that when opinion divides about the proper ethical environment for a community, it is unfair to allow a minority to dictate to majority will. The argument does assume, however, that the contours of a community's ethical environment must be decided collectively in a winner-take-all fashion, so that either the majority or some minority must determine its shape. If that assumption were true, then the argument would plainly be powerful. Some issues must indeed be decided in close to a winner-take-all way, and in those instances one group's view must prevail entirely, to the total exclusion of any other. One such issue is hotly debated now. Should the nation adopt a particular version of a Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI? But democracy does not demand that all political decisions be winner-take-all. On the contrary, in one central sphere of life, the economic environment, justice requires exactly the opposite. The economic environment in which we live, the distribution of property and preferences that create supply, demand, and price, affects us even more obviously than our ethical environment does. I am harmed by the fact that I own less property than I might, and that others have different tastes from those I might, and that others have different tastes from those I might want them to have. The economic environment may frustrate my efforts to raise my children to have the values I might wish them to have. I cannot, for example, raise them to have the skills and experience of collecting Renaissance masterpieces. But even if a majority of citizens wanted to assign all economic resources to themselves, it would not be just for them to do so. Justice requires that property be distributed in fair shares, allowing each individual his or her fair share of influence over the economic environment. People disagree, of course, about what constitutes a fair share, and a good part of modern political argument reflects that disagreement. In my view, fair shares are those that equalize, so far as this is possible, the opportunity costs to others of the material resources each person holds. See Chapter 2. I restrict the opportunity cost test to material, or as I have sometimes said, impersonal resources, because that test is not appropriate for personal resources such as talents and health. But my present point does not depend on any particular conception of distributive justice, because any remotely plausible theory will reject the principle of exclusive majoritarian control. If we take a parallel view of the ethical environment, then we must reject the claim of democratic theory assigns the majority complete control of that environment. We must insist that the ethical environment, like the economic, be the product of the choices individual people make. Of course, neither of these environments should be left completely to unregulated individual choices. We need laws to protect the economic environment from theft and monopolization, for example, and zoning regulations that respond to market externalities. These laws help ensure, so far as possible, that the economic environment has the shape it would have if resources were fairly distributed and markets were perfect. The ethical environment requires regulation in the same spirit to limit a minority's impact on the ethical environment to the impact its numbers and tastes justify. Zoning regulations which restrict the practice of potentially offensive acts to special or private places serve that purpose, for example. But restricting a minority's impact on the ethical environment through zoning is very different from cheating a minority of any impact at all, which is what the majoritarian argument proposes. If we treat the ethical environment in the same way we treat the economic environment, allowing it to be fixed by individual decisions made against the background of a fair distribution of resources, then we reject the majoritarian claim that the majority has a right to eliminate whatever it finds harmful in the ethical environment. Each member of the majority has right only to a fair impact on his environment, the same impact as any other single individual. He has no right to the environment that would make it easiest for him to raise his children to hold his favored opinions. He must try to do his best to that end in the environment fairness provides. Can we find any reason to treat the ethical environment differently from the economic environment? Some economic issues, such as SDI, must be decided collectively, all one way or the other, rather than as a resultant of individual forces. And our sense of integrity and fairness requires us to decide some issues of principle in the same way for everyone. For an account of the requirement of integrity and of the issues of principle it demands be decided the same for everyone, see Ronald Dworkin, Laws Empire, especially Chapter 6, for a more extended discussion of the distinction between matters of principle like those cited in the text and matters of policy like SDI, see Dworkin, a matter of principle, especially Chapter 3. For example, officials should not aim to execute some proportion of convicted murderers to match the proportion of citizens who favor capital punishment. But neither of these reasons for making some political decisions collectively provides any argument for fixing a community's ethical environment that way. There is no practical reason why that environment must be exactly what some group thinks best. And since the various individual acts and decisions that contribute to forming an ethical environment are no more the acts of government than the various individual economic decisions that fix the economic environment are, there is no question of governments violating integrity by letting individuals make these decisions in different ways. We should not subject the ethical and economic environments to different regimes of justice, because they are not two distinct environments, but interdependent aspects of the same one. The value of the resources someone controls is not fixed by laws of property alone, but also by other departments of law stipulating how we can use that property. So moralistic legislation, which discriminates among some uses of property or leisure, always affects price and value to some degree. In some circumstances, that effect is significant. Morally inspired prohibition laws are an example. The judgment whether a particular distribution of a community's resources is just must therefore take into account the degree of liberty citizens have. This argument is developed at considerable length in its consequences for liberalism described in Chapter 3. If we insist that the value of the resources people hold must be fixed by the interaction of individual choices rather than by the collective decisions of a majority, then we have already decided that the majority has no right to decide what kinds of lives everyone must lead. Once we accept that the economic and ethical environments are unified, in other words, we must accept liberal tolerance in matters of ethics because any contrary view denies the unity. The majoritarian argument we have been considering is politically the most powerful argument against liberal tolerance. It was allowed a conspicuous place in the majority opinion in Bowers. This part of our overall discussion is therefore of considerable patriarchal importance. But it is important to bear in mind its limits. It is aimed only at the majoritarian argument. It should not be taken as a statement of the exclusive ground of liberal tolerance, or as resting the entire value of liberty on an economic analogy. Nor does it purport to define any special rights to particularly important liberties, such as freedom of speech or association. It only denies the majoritarian argument's essential premise that the shape of the ethical environment as a whole must be fixed win-take-all by the majority's wishes. If the concept of community has an important role in the criticism of liberal tolerance, it must be in a more robust sense than simply as a name for a political unity over which majority rule roams. 2. Community and concern. The second communitarian argument, the argument of paternalism, appeals to the idea of a community in a more robust sense. It begins in the attractive idea that a true political community must be more than a Hobbesian association for mutual benefits in which each citizen regards all others as useful means to his or her own ends. It must be an association in which each takes some special interest in the well-being of others for its own sake. The argument adds that people who are genuinely concerned about others take an interest in their critical as well as their volitional well-being. I must explain that distinction because it is crucial to the argument of paternalism. The discussion in this section draws on material and lectures I gave at Stanford University under the auspices of the Tanner Foundation. These will appear in a forthcoming collection of Tanner Foundation lectures to be published by the Foundation. See Chapter 6. There are two senses in which people have interests, two ways in which their lives can go better or worse. Someone's volitional well-being is improved whenever he has or achieves something he wants. That characterization of volitional interests ignores the fact that some of the things a person wants may conflict with other things he wants. But the refinements needed to take account of that fact are not necessary for the general distinction between volitional and critical interests I make in the text. But his critical well-being is improved only by his having or achieving those things that he should want, that is, achievements or experiences that it would make his life a worse one not to want. We can make this distinction subjectively as a distinction between two ways in which a person might understand or regard his own interests. I myself, for example, consider some of the things I want very much as failing under my volitional interests. I want good food and fewer visits to the dentist and to sail better than I do, and my life therefore goes better when I have them. But I do not think that I ought to want these things, or that my life would be a poorer one if for some reason I did not. But I take a different view of other things I want, such as having a close relationship with my children and achieving some success in my work. I do not think that having a close relationship with my children is important just because I happen to want it. On the contrary, I want it because I believe a life without such relationships is impoverished. We make the same distinction objectively, that is, as a distinction not between two ways in which people might regard these interests, but between two classes of interests people actually have. People can fail to recognize their own critical interests. It makes sense to say that someone who has no regard for friendship or religion or talent in work, for example, leads a poor life for that reason, whether he agrees or not. We also make critical judgments about ourselves. People all too often come to think, toward the end, that they have ignored what they only then realize is really important to their lives. The distinction between critical and volitional well-being is not the distinction between what is really in my interests and what I only think is. My volitional interests are genuine, real interests, not merely reflections of my present judgments, which I may later decide are mistakes about where my critical interests lie. The two kinds of interests, the two modes of well-being, are distinct. I can intelligibly want something without thinking it makes my life a better life to have. Indeed, a life in which someone wanted only what he thought it in his critical interests to have Indeed, a life in which someone wanted only what he thought it in his critical interests to have would be a sad, preposterous mess of a life. Preposterous. The distinction is complex and can be explored and criticized in many different ways. Some, for example, will be skeptical about the whole idea of critical interests or well-being. They may think that since no one can prove that it is in anyone's critical interests to want something he does not, then the whole idea of critical well-being is mistaken. It is not what? I shall not try to answer that skeptical objection here. I shall assume, as I believe most of us do in our ordinary lives, that we all have both kinds of interests. We can use the distinction between volitional and critical interests to distinguish two forms of paternalism. Volitional paternalism supposes that coercion can sometimes help people achieve what they already want to achieve. At least for that reason in their volitional interests. Critical paternalism supposes that coercion can sometimes provide people with lives that are better than the lives they now think good, and is therefore sometimes in their critical interests. The second communitarian argument appeals to critical rather than volitional paternalism. It forces us to confront a philosophical issue about critical well-being. We can evaluate someone's life in two ways. We can look first at the components of that life, the events, experiences, associations, and achievements that make it up, and ask whether, in our view, these components, in the combination we find them, make life good. We can look second at the attitudes of the person whose life it is. We can ask how he judges those components. We can ask whether he sought them or regards them as valuable, in short, whether he endorses them as serving his critical interests. What view should we take about the relationship between these two ways of looking at the critical value of a life? We should distinguish two answers. The additive view holds that components and endorsements are separate elements of value. If someone's life has the components of a good life, then it has critical value. If he endorses these components, then their value increases. The endorsement is frosting on the cake. But if it does not, the value of the components remains. This constitutive view, on the other hand, argues that no component contributes to the value of a life without endorsement. If a misanthrope is much loved but disdains love as worthless, his life is not much more valuable for the affection of others. The constitutive view is preferable for a variety of reasons. The additive view cannot explain why a good life is distinctively valuable for or to the person whose life it is. And it is implausible to think that someone can lead a better life against the grain of his most profound ethical convictions than at peace with them. If we accept the constitutive view, then we can answer the argument from critical paternalism in what we might call its crude or direct form. Suppose someone who would lead a homosexual life does not, out of fear of punishment. If he never endorses the life he leads as superior to the life he would otherwise have led, then his life has not been improved, even in the critical sense, by the paternalistic constraints he hates. We must recognize a more subtle aim of critical paternalism, however. Suppose the state deploys a combination of constraints and inducements such that a homosexual is converted and does in the end endorse and appreciate the conversion. Has his life then been improved? The answer turns on an issue I have so far neglected: the conditions and circumstances of genuine endorsement. There must be some constraints on endorsement, otherwise critical paternalism could always justify itself by adding chemical or electrical brainwashing to its regime. We must distinguish acceptable from unacceptable circumstances of endorsement. The distinction, as we know from the history of liberal theories of education, is a difficult one to draw, but any adequate account of acceptable circumstances would, I believe, include the following proposition. We would not improve someone's life, even though he endorsed the change we brought about, if the mechanisms we used to secure the change lessened his ability to consider the critical merits of the change in a reflective way. Threats of criminal punishment corrupt rather than enhance critical judgment, and even if the conversions they induce are sincere, these conversions cannot be counted as genuine in deciding whether the threats have improved someone's life. I shall not consider a form of critical paternalism more subtle in academic style, though it raises difficult and important questions about the concept of critical well-being. Suppose critical paternalism is aimed not at the present generation of homosexuals, but at the remote future. Suppose it aims to eliminate homosexuality as a form of life from the conceptual menu, so that future generations will not even be able to imagine such a life. It is extremely doubtful such a project could succeed. But assume that it could, and also, what many of us would not accept, that a homosexual life is inherently a bad life to lead. Would this kind of conceptual paternalism then be in the interests of people who would have led homosexual lives had these been on their menu? Some conceptual paternalism would certainly be in the interests of justice. The world would be a better place if no one could even imagine a life of genocide or racism, for example. Even so, it seems to me odd to think that a person's own life could be made a better life to have lived, in the critical sense, by constriction of his imagination. The second communitarian argument is therefore self-defeating. 3. Self-interest and community. A. Material needs. It is now a familiar idea in political as well as social theory that people need communities, and that social life is both natural and essential for human beings. The third communitarian argument declared that tolerance makes communities less able to serve their members' various social needs. In the 1950s, Lord Devlin offered a straightforward, though very implausible, version of this argument in criticism of the Wolfenden report, which successfully recommended liberalization of the laws against homosexuality in Britain. Patrick Devlin, The Enforcement of Morals, See Committee on Homosexual Offences and Prostitution, the Wolfenden report. Devlin said that a community cannot survive unless it achieves moral homogeneity backed by a sense of intuitive outrage, and that tolerance is therefore a kind of treason. His claim was widely attacked and seems contradicted by the stubborn survival of famously tolerant political communities such as Scandinavia. Devlin himself later said that he did not mean to suggest that tolerating homosexuality would subvert the community, but only that society might be threatened by tolerance, and must therefore reject any principle that rules out intolerance altogether. See Patrick Devlin, Law, Democracy and Morality, University of Pennsylvania Law Review. There are more sophisticated versions of the third argument, however. These claim not that tolerance will destroy a community, root and branch, but that it will cripple a community's ability to perform some crucial function. Different versions of the argument cite different functions as crucial, but one set of social needs is obvious. People need security and the economic benefits of division of labor. No one could lead an adequate human life without the mechanisms of community that rationalize production and consumption, provide public goods like police and armed forces, and ameliorate prisoners' dilemmas. But there is no reason to think that these instrumental benefits of community require moral homogeneity. There is no evidence that an illiberal society delivers the goods or the mail more efficiently than a liberal one. B. Intellectual needs. But people depend on community in ways that go beyond these evident economic and security benefits. They need a common culture and particularly a common language, even to have personalities, and culture and language are social phenomena. We can have only the thoughts, ambitions, and convictions that are possible within the vocabulary that language and culture provide, so we are all, in a patent and deep way, the creatures of the community as a whole. That evident dependence does not, however, suggest that a community must be morally or in any other way homogeneous in order to benefit its members in the right way. On the contrary, cultural and linguistic provision is richer, and therefore apparently more advantageous, in pluralistic and tolerant communities. Of course, some, perhaps a great many, people want to belong to a morally homogeneous society and feel a keen sense of loss, for which we should have sympathy when traditional ethical patterns are disturbed. But that point, though important, has nothing to do with the community's success in supplying people's intellectual needs of culture and language. It touches distributive justice, the issue raised by the first communitarian argument about the right standards to use in distributing influence over an ethical environment. Michael Sandel and others have proposed a particularly strong form of the claim that people need community for intellectual as well as material reasons. This argues, so far as I understand it, that people need community not only for culture and language, but for identity and self-reference, because people can only identify themselves as members of some community to which they belong. Liberalism and the limits of justice. So I cannot but think of myself except as an American, or an Oxford Don, or a Red Sox fan. There are two ways to interpret this strong claim. One makes a point of philosophical logic. I am necessarily an American because, were I not an American, I would not be the person I am. Readers interested in this issue of philosophical logic should begin with Saul Kripke, Naming a Necessity. But this says nothing at all about the kind of relations I must or should have with other Americans, or about the content or character of our political community. It certainly does not follow, nor does it seem plausible, that any community I am necessarily a member of must be morally homogeneous, or that it must reject moral pluralism in favor of intolerance to protect that intimate connection. The second interpretation of the self-reference claim seems more pertinent. It makes a claim about phenomenological possibility. People cannot distance themselves, when thinking about their own well-being, from certain kinds of association or connection with community. A profoundly believing Catholic, for example, could not even begin to reflect about whether to regard her Catholicism as important, because Catholicism would be too central to her personality to make questions of that character sensible for her. This interpretation of the third communitarian argument runs as follows. In a community that is morally homogeneous, people identify with the shared morality in just the way that devout Catholic identifies with Catholicism. The community, for them, is a community of shared beliefs that helps constitute their own identity. If the community tolerates deviation, such citizens will suffer the shock of deracination. They will lose the connection to a moral faith that is essential to proper self-identification. The phenomenology on which this argument rests seems wrong, or at least overstated. No doubt it is impossible for someone to detach himself from all associations and connections in considering what kind of life to lead. No one can think intelligibly about that question while prescinding from every aspect of the context in which he lives. So no one can put everything about himself in question all at once. But it hardly follows that for each person there is some one connection or association so fundamental that it cannot be detached for inspection while holding others in place. It is an even more serious mistake to think that this is true of the same association or connection for everyone, or that this universally non-detachable connection is to a shared sexual ethic, which must be shared within a political community rather than within some smaller or different community of, say, friends or co-religionists. Even if we were to accept this odd collection of assumptions in full, the argument would still be vulnerable because it relies on a further set of doubtful assumptions about the consequences of toleration. It assumes first that when a political community tolerates breaches of some principle of conventional ethics or morality, this tolerance must inevitably shake the citizens' own attachment to that principle, since their sense of being people is partly defined by their adherence to it. But the strength of people's convictions need not depend on the enforcement or even the popularity of those convictions in their political community. Many American Catholics are as deeply committed to their Catholicism as are most Spanish Catholics. Second, the argument assumes that if people become detached from formally unquestioned convictions, their personalities will disintegrate. But why should people not be able to reassemble their sense of identity, built around a somewhat different and more tolerant set of conditions, when their faith in the morality they associate with their family or community is for some reason shaken? C. The need for objectivity. So far we have considered communitarian arguments built on claims that people need the material and intellectual resources that a community provides, and that they need some attachment to community to constitute their identity. We must now notice a more subtle argument. People need a morally homogeneous community as a necessary conceptual background to a moral and ethical life. Pourquoi more subtle? They need that background because, in Philip Selnick's illuminating phrase, ethics must have an anchor, some objective standing outside the convictions of the agent, and the only possible anchor is the unquestioned, shared convictions of the agent's political community. The idea of a communitarian morality. California Law Review. The first of these two propositions, that ethics and morality must have an anchor, seems right. Our ethical experience treats the question of how to live well as a question calling for reflection and judgment. not just choice. We think it possible to be mistaken about what sort of life is good, and that a serious mistake is a tragedy. But what does the second proposition, that a morally homogeneous community is the only possible anchor, mean? It might mean that people will feel that their ethical and moral judgments are grounded, are true independently of their thinking them true, only when their judgments are confirmed by an unquestioned conventional morality. But people who hold unconventional, even eccentric, views are characteristically convinced that these views are objectively sound. Indeed, the more unconventional the view, the more likely its holder is to claim transcendent authority for it. So we must understand the second proposition in a different way. We must understand it to mean that anyone who does claim objectivity outside convention is making a philosophical mistake. So understood, the second proposition might be thought to support the following communitarian argument. If the only available form of objectivity in ethics and morality is the objectivity of conventional practice, a tolerant, pluralistic community robs its members of the only possible source of the ethical and moral anchor they need. There is a difficulty evident in that argument, however. The objectivity people want and assume they have for their moral and ethical conviction is not the watered-down version this argument offers. Most people implicitly, if not explicitly, rejected the offered anchor. Paradoxically, for the present argument, the single firmest part of our conventional morality, shared across every other division, is the second-order conviction that ethical and moral judgments cannot be made true or false by consensus, that they have force across cultural boundaries, that they are not, in short, creators of culture or community, but rather judges of them. The wide popularity of this full-blooded objectivism does not, of course, argue for its truth or even its philosophical coherence, and I do not consider either here. My point is only that when a society develops this critical attitude, which insists that its own customs and conventions are constantly vulnerable to test and revision against some higher and more independent standard, it irretrievably forfeits the convention-rooted kind of objectivity available within a less critical, simpler community. 4. Integration with community. A. Integration. I come finally to the fourth, and in my view the most important and interesting, communitarian argument against liberal tolerance. Liberalism, according to many of its critics, presupposes a sharp distinction between people's own welfare or well-being and the well-being of the political community to which they belong. The fourth argument against tolerance denies that distinction. It claims that the lives of individual people and that of their community are integrated, and that the critical success of any one of their lives is an aspect of, and so is it dependent on, the goodness of the community as a whole. I shall call people who accept this view, adopting a fashionable term, civic republicans. They take the same attitude toward the moral and ethical health of the community as they do toward their own. Liberals understand the question whether the law should tolerate homosexuality as asking whether some people have the right to impose their own ethical convictions on others. Civic Republicans understand it as asking whether the common life of the community, on which the critical value of their own lives depends, should be healthy or degenerate. According to the argument from integration, once the distinction between personal and communal well-being is recognized as mistaken and civic republicanism flourishes, citizens will necessarily be as concerned for the soundness of the community's ethical health, including the views of sexual morality that it sponsors or discourages, as for the fairness or generosity of its tax system or foreign aid program. Both are aspects of the community's overall health, and an integrated citizen who recognizes that his own well-being is derived from the community's well-being must be concerned with the community's overall health, not with one selected aspect of it. This is an important argument, even though it ends in serious error. I should say at once what I regard as good in the argument, and where, in my view, it goes wrong. Its most fundamental premise is right and important. Political communities have a communal life, and the success or failure of a community's communal life is part of what determines whether its members' lives are good or bad. The argument's most fundamental mistake lies in misunderstanding the character of the communal life that a political community can have. The argument succumbs to anthropomorphism. It supposes that a communal life is the life of an outside outsized person, that it has the same shape, encounters the same moral and ethical watersheds and dilemmas, and is subject to the same standards of success and failure as the several lives of the citizens who make it up. The illiberal force of the overall argument depends on this fallacy, which forfeits much of the advantage gained by the argument's sound and attractive premise. B. A community's communal life. We need to begin a more detailed account of what the phenomenon of integration is supposed to be. The civic republican, who recognizes that he is integrated with his community, is not the same as the altruistic citizen for whom the interests of others are of capital importance. This is a crucial distinction, because the argument from integration, which we are now considering, is different from the argument of paternalism and other arguments that begin in the idea that a virtuous citizen will be concerned for the well-being of others. The argument from integration does not suppose that the good citizen will be concerned for the well-being of fellow citizens. It argues that he must be concerned for his own well-being, and that, just in virtue of that concern, he must take an interest in the moral life of the community of which he is a member. So, the integrated citizen differs from the altruistic citizen, and we need not some further distinctions to see how and why. We associate actions with what I shall call unit of agency, the person or group or entity treated as the author of and held responsible for the action. We normally consider ourselves, as individuals, to be the agency unit of, and only of, actions or decisions we initiate or take on our own. I take myself to be responsible for only what I do. I take no pride or satisfaction or remorse or shame in what you do, no matter how interested I might be in your life or in its consequences. Often a person directs his actions at his own well-being in either a volitional or a critical sense. The unit of agency and what we might call the unit of the agent's concern are then identical. When someone acts altruistically, whether out of charity or a sense of justice, he continues to regard himself as the unit of agency, but the unit of his concern migrates or expands. Paternalism, including moral paternalism, is a subcase of altruism. If I believe that homosexuals lead degraded lives, I might think that I act in their interests when I campaign for laws making their conduct criminal. Good argument. Integration is a different phenomenon, according to the argument I am considering, because it supposes that the appropriate unit of agency, for some actions affecting the well-being of an individual, is not the individual but some community to which he belongs. He belongs to that unit of agency ethically. He shares in the success or failure of acts or achievements or practices that may be completely independent of anything he himself, considered as an individual, has done. Some examples are familiar. Many Germans born well after World War II feel shame and responsibility to compensate for Nazi atrocities, for instance. John Rawls offers, in a slightly different context, an example that is much more illuminating for our purposes. A theory of justice. A healthy orchestra is itself a unit of agency. The various musicians who compose it are exhilarated in the way personal triumph exhilarates, not by the quality or brilliance of their individual contributions, but by the performance of the orchestra as a whole. It is the orchestra that succeeds or fails, and the success or failure of that community is the success or failure of each of its members. So, integration is strikingly different from altruism and paternalism. It is also different from vicarious or indirect pride or regret. When parents take pride in the achievements of their children, or friends rejoice in each other's success, or brothers in some cultures are dishonored by a sister's shame, the unit of agency, the actor whose acts have brought pride or rejoicing or dishonor, remains individual. The vicarious emotion is second order and parasitic. The success or failure, achievement or disgrace, remains primarily and distinctly that of someone else, and the vicarious concern reflects not participation in any act but a particular connection with the actor. The argument from integration escapes the objection I made to the second, paternalistic argument, because it rejects the whole structure of agency and concern on which the paternalistic argument rests. The argument from integration forbids us to think in Mill's terms about whether we intervene to protect other people, or only the agent himself, from some harm the agent's conduct inflicts. It rejects that whole individuated way of thinking. Its unit of agency is the community itself, and it asks only how the community's decisions about liberty and regulation will affect the community's life and character. It insists that citizens' lives are bound up in their communal life, and that there can be no private accounting of the critical success or failure of their individual lives one by one. So the personification latent in the idea of integration is genuine and deep. The more familiar ideas of altruism, paternalism, and vicarious emotion are built around individual units of agency and concern. Integration supposes a very different structure of concepts, in which the community, and not the individual, is fundamental. All this may suggest that integration depends on the Baroque metaphysics, which holds that communities are fundamental entities in the universe and that individual human beings are only abstractions or illusions. But integration can be understood in a different way, as depending not on the ontological primary of the community, but on ordinary and familiar facts about the social practices that human beings develop. An orchestra has a collective life not because it is ontologically more fundamental than its members, but in virtue of their practices and attitudes. The musicians recognize a personified unit of agency in which they no longer figure as individuals but as components. The community's collective life consists in the activities they treat as constituting its collective life. I shall call this interpretation of integration, which assumes that integration depends on social practices and attitudes, the practice view, to distinguish it from the metaphysical view, which assumes that integration depends on the ontological primacy of community. I do not mean to suggest that the practice view is reductionist. When an integrated community exists, the statements citizens make within it about its success or failure are not simply statistical summaries of their own successes or failures as individuals. An integrated community has interests and concerns of its own life to lead. Integration and community are genuine phenomena, even on the practice view. But on that view, they are created by and embedded in attitudes and practices, and do not precede them. On the practice view, therefore, a special kind of case must be made before integration can be claimed. It must be shown that social practice has in fact created a composite unit of agency. It would be nonsense for someone to claim integration with some community or institution by personal fiat, that is, simply by declaring and believing that he is part of it. I cannot just declare myself integrated with the Berlin Symphony Orchestra and thereafter share in that institution's triumphs and occasional lapses. Nor can I bring a common unit of agency into existence by fiat. I may declare and believe, for example, that philosophers whose surname starts with D are a common unit of agency in philosophical work, and that I can properly take pride and credit in Donald Davidson and Michael Dummett's work the way a cymbal player can take pride and credit in his orchestra's performance. But I would be wrong. There must already be a common unit of agency, to which I am already attached, for it to be appropriate for me to regard myself as ethically integrated with its actions. So the argument from integration must rely on some theory about how collective units of agency are established, and how individual membership in them is fixed. On the metaphysical view of integration, collective units of agency just exist. They are more real than their members. But on the practice view, collective units of agency are not primitive. They are constituted by social practices and attitudes, and anyone defending this view of integration must identify and describe these practices. Our orchestra example is instructive because it indicates the features that provide a common unit of agency in central or paradigmatic cases. First, collective agency presupposes acts socially denominated as collective, that is, acts identified and individuated as those of a community as a whole rather than of members of the community as individuals. An orchestral performance is treated as a collective act in that sense, both by its members and by the community as a whole. Second, the individual acts that constitute collective acts are concerted. They are performed self-consciously as contributing to the collective act, rather than as isolated acts that happen to coincide in some way. The orchestra performs a particular concerto only when its members play with a cooperative intention. It would not perform at all if its musicians played exactly the notes assigned to them in the score at exactly the designated moments and in the same room, but with no intention of playing together as an orchestra. Third, the composition of the community, who is treated as a member of it, is tailored to its collective acts, so that a community's collective acts explain its tailored to its collective acts, explain its composition, and vice versa. Since an orchestra is a common unit of agency for the production of music, its members are musicians. The collective acts of a community constitute its communal life. On the metaphysical view of integration, a community is a superperson, and its collective life embodies all the features and dimensions of a human life. But the practice view defines a community's communal life more narrowly. It includes only the acts treated as collective by the practices and attitudes that create the community as a collective agent. The communal life of an orchestra is limited to producing orchestral music. It is only a musical life. This fact determines the character and limits of the ethical integration of the musicians' lives into the communal life. The musicians treat their performances together as the performance of their orchestra personified, and they share in its triumphs and failures as their own. But they do not suppose that the orchestra also has a sex life, in some way composed of the sexual activities of its members, or that it has headaches, or a high blood pressure, or responsibilities of friendship, or crises over whether it should care less about music and take up photography instead. Though the first violinist may be concerned about a colleague's sexual habits or deviance, this is concern for a friend that reflects altruism, not self-concern for any composite unit of agency which includes him. His moral integrity is not compromised by the drama's adultery. Bonjour, ça fait bien longtemps. C. A political community's communal life. How far can we regard a political community, a nation or a state, as having a communal life on the practice view? The formal political acts of a political community, the acts of its government through its legislative, executive, and judicial institutions, meet all the conditions of collective agency were identified when we considered why an orchestra has a communal life. Our practices identify these formal political acts as acts of a distinct legal person rather than of some collection of individual citizens. The United States, rather than particular officials and soldiers, fought a war in Vietnam. The United States, rather than particular officials or citizens, imposes taxes at particular rates, distributes some of the funds it collects in welfare programs, and declines to distribute funds for other programs. The acts of particular people, votes of members of Congress, for example, and commands of generals, constitute these collective acts only because these officials act self-consciously under a constitutional structure that transforms their individual behavior into national decisions. There is at least a rough fit, moreover, between the membership of a decent, democratic political community and those formal collective acts. In a creditable democracy, every citizen who reaches a certain age and meets other conditions and can participate indirectly in formal political decisions by voting, speaking, lobbying, demonstrating, and so forth. I do not mean that these participatory acts are themselves collective acts of the political community as a whole. They are not, but they may be collective acts of some smaller community within it. A demonstration, for example, may be part of the communal life of a political action group, which, though political in its aims, is not in itself a political community, because it does not administer its affairs through a monopoly of coercive power over its members. And the citizens of a political community are those who are particularly affected by its formal political acts. So treating the legislative, executive, and judicial decisions as a political community's communal acts helps to explain the community's composition. It is composed of those who play some role in those decisions and who are most directly affected by them. That much seems relatively uncontroversial. If a community has a communal life at all, its formal political decisions must be part of that life. But we must ask what else, in addition to those formal political acts, is part of its communal life. The communitarian argument from integration, which we are exploring, claims that formal political acts do not exhaust the nation's communal life. The argument supposes that the political community also has a communal sex life. It supposes that the sexual activities of individual citizens somehow combine into a national sex life in the way in which the performances of individual musicians combine into an orchestral performance, or the distinct acts of the citizens and officials of a political community combine in legislation. For only if this were true could one citizen's life be defiled by the sexual practices of another. If we accept the anthropomorphic, metaphysical view of the political community, then we can begin at least to persuade ourselves that a state or nation has a sex life toward which the sexual activity of individual citizens contributes in some mysterious way. But if we insist instead on the practice view, then the argument from integration must defend the proposition that the community has a sex life in a very different way. It must show that our social practices and attitudes and conventions in fact create and recognize the national sexual act. You will you will have anticipated my judgment about that project. Consider the three features we identified as supporting the claim of communal musical life in the case of an orchestra. None of them is satisfied for the claim of a national sex life. Our conventions recognize no distinctly collective national sexual activity. When we speak of a nation's sexual preferences and habits, we speak statistically, not, as in the case of an orchestra's performance, of some collective achievement or disgrace. Of course, as I emphasize later, that is not to say that no community does or could recognize a collective sex act. Nor do we have conventions or practices that provide structures for cooperative sexual activity on a national scale, in the way our Constitution provides a mechanism for electing presidents. Nor is the composition of a political community in any way related to the idea that its communal life has a sexual side. The criteria of citizenship can neither explain nor be explained by the assumption of any collective sexual venture. Citizens are by and large born into their political communities, and most have no real prospect of leaving the one they are born into. Citizens are not mutually self-selected, like members of a fraternal organization, nor are they chosen for some particular talent or ambition, like musicians in an orchestra, nor are they identified by some independently given religious faith or sexual conviction, or even, in the modern world of immigration and boundary shifts, by racial or ethnic or linguistic type or background. People of every race, faith, and ambition may be born into the same political community, and it is deeply implausible that the characterization of communal life that best fits such a community could be one that assumes that it must choose one faith or a set of personal ambitions or ethnic allegiance, or one set of standards of sexual responsibility, as a healthy individual person must. That characterization not only does not fit the criteria of citizenship, it makes them close to nonsensical. Perhaps we cannot rule out, a priori, the possibility that some other social grounds might be found to support the claim that a nation has a collective sex life, grounds very different from those to which we naturally appeal in explaining why a symphony or a piece of legislation is a collective, communal act. But I cannot see what those other grounds could be. If none can be suggested, then the communitarian argument from integration can succeed. If at all, only by falling back on the anthropomorphic view of a political community most readers would be anxious to disavow. I should add two clarifications here. First, I have not claimed that there are no communities whose collective life has a sexual aspect. There are all kinds of communities. There are associations of STEM fanatics who engage in collective projects of collection, for example, and some might be in the nature of sexual rather than musical orchestras. It has been suggested, for example, that some families do, and that others might, see themselves as communities for propagation, in which case the sexual acts of family members might well be seen as collective in the sense that the integration argument assumes. My point is only that neither the United States nor its several states are communities that have a communal sex life, and that the argument from integration, used to justify liberal political decisions by and across those political communities, accordingly fails. Second, I have not considered the argument that the members of a political community should develop whatever practices would be needed in order that it would then be true that the community had a collective sex life. I have no idea how such an argument could be defended or made to seem plausible. Someone might say, for example, that people should try to expand the communal life of their political community because the phenomenological sensation of integration is itself desirable in the way some people think sensual pleasure or the exhilaration of danger is desirable. But if the value of integration lies in a particular sensation, it would hardly be necessary to seek integration with a political community to achieve it. People belong to a variety of communities, and most people can belong to many more if they choose. They belong or may belong to families, neighborhoods, alumni groups, fraternal associations, factories, colleges, teams, orchestras, ethnic groups, expatriate communities, and so forth. So these would provide ample opportunities for people to have whatever degree of the experience of integration they might think valuable, without having to seek that experience in the political community, where it is inevitably harder to secure. In any case, the argument that we should try to create a community with a collective sex life is very different from the integration argument we have been considering. For the latter argument begins in, and draws its force from, The claim that we are already in such a community that we have no choice now but to look after the sex life of others because if their lives are degraded, ours are too. It does not follow, of course, from my claim that ethical integration is possible only when social practices create the necessary conceptual background that ethical integration is mandatory or even defensible on every occasion when they do. No one should think his own critical interests tied to the success or failure of a community that does not recognize him as an equal member or that denies him the most basic human rights, for example. Compare, in this connection, the parallel conditions of political obligations discussed in Dworkin, Law's Empire. 5. Liberal community. A. Liberal civic Republicans. The illiberal argument from integration assumes that a political community has a life that includes a sex life. This assumption is half right. A political community does have a life, but not that life. If so, the argument from integration collapses as a critique of liberal tolerance in sexual matters. I shall now explore the part of the argument that is right. Its important underlying premise that political integration is of great ethical importance. I shall try to show that although liberals have not emphasized the ethical importance of integration, recognizing its importance does not threaten, but rather nourishes, liberal principles. First, I must caution against a misreading of my argument so far. I have not said that people should not fully identify with their own political community, or that full identification is impossible because its conditions cannot be met. I have argued rather for a particular view of what identifying with community means. Citizens identify with their political community when they recognize that the community has a communal life, and that the success or failure of their own lives is ethically dependent on the success or failure of that communal life. So what counts as full identification depends on what the communal life is understood to be. The liberal view of integration I shall describe takes a limited view of the dimensions of a political community's communal life. But it is not therefore a watered-down conception of identification with community. It is a full, genuine, intense conception exactly because it is discriminatory. Those who argue that identification with community requires illiberal legislation are not arguing for a deeper level of identification than liberalism allows. They argue only for a different account of what a community's collective life really is. If the liberal account is correct, and theirs is wrong, liberalism provides a more genuine form of identification than its critics can. What then is the communal life of a political community? I said that the collective life of a political community includes its official political acts, legislation, adjudication, enforcement, and the other executive functions of government. An integrated citizen will count his community's success or failure in these formal political acts as resonating in his own life, as improving or diminishing it. On the liberal view, nothing more should be added. These formal political acts of the community as a whole should be taken to exhaust the communal life of a political body, so that citizens are understood to act together as a collective only in that structured way. This view of a political community's communal life will seem too meager to any, and it is not necessary to the argument for liberal tolerance I have been developing. But it is worth exploring why the meager view might be enough after all. The idea that a community's collective life is only its formal political life appears disappointing because it seems to eviscerate the idea of integration, to leave it with no work to do. The idea that people's lives should be seen as integrated with the life of their community suggests, at first sight, an exciting expansion of political theory. It seems to promise a politics devoted to advancing the collective good as well as, or perhaps instead of, protecting individual rights. The anthropomorphic conception of communal life, that the life of the community reflects all aspects of the lives of individuals, including their sexual choices and preferences, appears to fulfill that promise. It claims that an integrated citizen will reject liberal tolerance in favor of a commitment to healthy sexual standards imposed on all, because caring for community means caring that its life be good as well as just. But my suggestion that communal life is limited to political activities does not expand political justification beyond what liberals already accept. If the life of a community is limited to formal political decisions, if the critical success of a community therefore depends only on the success or failure of its legislative, executive, and educative decisions, then we can accept the ethical primacy of the community's life without abandoning or compromising liberal tolerance and neutrality about the good life. We simply repeat that success at political decisions requires tolerance. Of course, that proposition can be and has been challenged. The argument for integration presents a new challenge to those for liberal tolerance, however, only if it assumes an anthropomorphic picture of community, or at least one that includes more than the community's purely formal political activities. If we limit a political community's communal life to its formal political decisions, integration offers no threat to liberal principles, and it seems disappointing exactly for that reason. It would be a mistake, however, to conclude that integration is an idea of no consequence, that it adds nothing to political morality. A citizen who identifies with the political community, by accepting the community's ethical priority, will offer no new arguments about the justice or wisdom of any political decision. He will, however, take a different attitude toward politics. We can see the difference by contrasting his attitude not with the selfish individual of invisible hand fantasies, but with a person supposed to be the paragon of liberalism by its critics, the person who rejects integration but is moved by a sense of justice. That person will vote and work and lobby only for the political decisions he believes justice demands. He will nevertheless draw a sharp line between what justice requires of him and the critical success of his own life. He will not count his own life as any less successful if, in spite of his best efforts, his community accepts great economic inequality or racial or other forms of unfair discrimination, or unjust constraints on individual freedom, unless of course he is himself the victim of these various forms of discrimination. The integrated liberal will not separate his private and public lives in that way. He will count his own life as diminished, a less good life than he might have had, if he lives in an unjust community, no matter how hard he has tried to make it just. That fusion of political morality and critical self-interest seems to me to be the true nerve of civic republicanism, the important way in which individual citizens should merge their interests and personality into political community. It states a distinctly liberal ideal, one that flourishes only within a liberal society. I cannot assure you, of course, that a society of integrated citizens will inevitably achieve a more just society than a non-integrated community would. Injustice is the upshot of too many other factors, of failures of energy or industry, of weakness of will, of philosophical error. A community of people who accept integration in this sense will always have one important advantage over communities whose citizens deny integration. An integrated citizen accepts that the value of his own life depends on the success of his community in treating everyone with equal concern. Suppose this sense is public and transparent. Everyone understands that everyone else shares that attitude. Then the community will have an important source of stability and legitimacy even though its members disagree greatly about what justice is. They will share an understanding that politics is a joint venture in a particularly strong sense, that everyone of every conviction and economic level has a strong personal stake for someone with a lively sense of his critical interests, in justice not only for himself but for everyone else as well. That understanding provides a powerful bond underlying even the most heated argument over particular policies and principles. People who think of justice in the non-integrated way as requiring necessary compromises of their own interests for the sake of others will tend to suspect that those who resist programs that require evident sacrifices from them because they reject a conception of justice on which those programs are based, act out of self-interested bias, whether deliberate or subconscious. Political argument will then degenerate into the sullen trading that destroys civic republicanism. That kind of suspicion has no place to root among people who take political disagreement to be disagreement, not about what sacrifices are required from each, but about how to serve the common interests of all in securing a genuinely just solution. Disagreement persists against that background, as it is desirable that it should. But it is a healthy disagreement among partners whose interests coalesce, who know that they are not antagonists in interest, who know that they win or lose together.
Coalesce.
Coalesce. C'est vraiment ça en plus. Se fondre. Coalesce. Integration, so understood, gives a fresh meaning to the old idea of a commonweal, a genuine interest people share in politics, even when political disagreements are profound. Of course, all this is utopian. We can scarcely hope that a thoroughly integrated political society will ever be realized. It will not be realized in coming decades. But we are now exploring utopia, an ideal of community we can define, defend, and perhaps even grope our way toward, in good moral and metaphysical conscience. B. Ethical priority. The consequences of civic republicanism in the liberal mode are therefore attractive. But there is a considerable gap in the argument I have offered, because I have offered no reason, so far, why people should accept integration in the liberal sense, when they should regard the success of their lives as dependent, in the way I just described, on the justice of their community's political decisions. We cannot hope to provide a knockdown demonstration by way of answer to that question. But we can try to make the idea of liberal community more attractive by identifying aspects of the good life that are made possible or are nourished in a just state. The skeletal, and I fear somewhat cryptic, discussion in this section borrows from and is much expanded in chapter 6. So the next one. I shall describe only one strand of that project, and that in skeletal form. It begins in a weak form of Plato's view, articulated in the Republic, that morality and well-being are interdependent in an adequate ethics, that someone who behaves unjustly leads a worse life in consequence. That is hardly a plausible view if we have in mind what I call volitional well-being. There seems no inherent connection between my being just and my having what I want. But Plato's view seems more plausible when we have critical well-being in mind. The criteria of a life good in the critical sense cannot be defined acontextually, as if the same standards held for all people in all stages of history. Someone lives well when he responds appropriately to his circumstances. The ethical question is not how human beings should live, but how someone in my position should live. A great deal turns, therefore, on how my position is to be defined, and it seems compelling that justice should figure in the description. The ethical question becomes, what is a good life for someone entitled to the share of resources I am entitled to have? And against that background, Plato's view of critical success is appealing. Someone does pro tanto a poor job of living, responds pro tanto some poorly to his circumstances, if he acts unjustly. We need not accept the strong view that Plato in fact defended, that no one ever profits from injustice. Perhaps the great lives of some artists would not have been possible in a fully just society, and it would not follow that they had bad lives. But it does follow that it counts against the goodness of any life, even theirs, that it was supported by injustice. Now notice what might seem to be a contradiction between two ethical ideals most of us embrace. The first dominates our private lives. We believe we have particular responsibilities toward those with whom we have special relationships. Ourselves, our family, friends, and colleagues. We spend more of our time and other resources on them than on strangers, and we think this right. We believe that someone who showed equal concern for all members of his political community in his private life would be defective. The second ideal dominates our political life. The just citizen, in his political life, insists on equal concern for all. He votes and works for policies that he thinks treat every citizen as an equal. He shows no more concern in choosing among candidates and programs for himself or his own family than for people who are only statistics to him. A competent overall ethics must reconcile these two ideals. They can be reconciled adequately, however, only when politics actually succeeds in distributing resources in the way justice requires. If a just distribution has been secured, Then the resources people control are morally as well as legally theirs. Using them as they wish, and as special attachments and projects require, in no way derogates from the recognizing that all citizens are entitled to a just share. But when injustice is substantial, people who are drawn to both the ideals of personal projects and attachments on the one hand and equality of political concern on the other, are placed in a kind of ethical dilemma. They must compromise one of the ideals, and each direction of compromise impairs the critical success of their lives. Acting justly is not entirely a passive matter. It means not only not cheating, but also doing what one can to reduce injustice. So someone acts unjustly when he fails to devote resources he knows that he's not entitled to have to the needs of those who have less. That failure will hardly be redeemed by occasional charity, limited and arbitrary in the way charity inevitably is. So if the critical value of a life is diminished by a failure to act as justice requires, then it is diminished by ignoring the injustice in one's own political community. A life entirely devoted to reducing injustice so far as one can, on the other hand, would be at least equally diminished. When injustice is substantial and pervasive in a political community, any private citizen who accepts a personal responsibility to do whatever he possibly can to repair it will end by denying himself the personal projects and attachments, as well as the pleasures and frivolities that are essential to a decent and rewarding life. Someone with a vivid sense of his own critical interests is inevitably thwarted when his community fails in its responsibilities of justice, and this is so even when he, for his own part, has done all he personally can to encourage it to succeed. Each of us shares that powerful reason for wanting our community to be a just one. A just society is a prerequisite for a life that respects both ideals, neither of which should be abandoned. So our private lives, our success or failure in leading the lives people like us should have, are in that limited but powerful way parasitic on our success together in politics. Political community has that ethical primacy over our individual lives. 6, ce sera equality and the good life. 30 minutes.